What if I told you 4 kids from frozen Nova Scotia showed up in Montreal with $100 and a misunderstood letter, then sold 20 million records? Their video hit MTV before Madonna. The Rolling Stones used them as a decoy for a secret club gig. Then their leader fled to the Bahamas while alcohol nearly killed him. A 3-guitar attack that shook arenas couldn't save the brotherhood from collapse. This is the rise and fall of April Wine. Level 1. Origins, Displacement, Formation. Waverley, Nova Scotia, late 1960s. If you wanted to make it in rock and roll, this was about the worst place you could start. No record labels, no industry connections, no path to the spotlight, just the frozen Atlantic coast, and the dream that maybe, just maybe, a group of Canadian kids could break through. The Henman brothers, David on guitar, Richie on drums, and their cousin Jim on bass, formed the core of what would become April Wine in 1969. But they knew they needed something more. They needed a frontman who could write original songs, someone who could lead them out of the club circuit and into something bigger. They found him in Miles Goodwin, a guitarist and vocalist from Woodstock, New Brunswick. Goodwin brought discipline, ambition, and most importantly, a songwriter's ear that would define everything they built together. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Level 2. Identity and Early Sound. The name April Wine didn't come from deep meaning or philosophical inquiry. The members simply thought the 2 words sounded good together. But that humble beginning masked a radical commitment. In a market dominated by top 40 cover bands playing high school dances in church halls, April Wine intended to perform only original music. This was their first act of defiance, and it nearly killed them before they started. By early 1970, the reality was undeniable. Nova Scotia couldn't sustain their ambitions. The decision to relocate to Montreal was born from what can only be described as a productive misunderstanding. After sending a demo tape to Terry Flood and Donald Tarleton of Aquarius Records, the band received a polite response stating the label owners would be happy to meet them if they were ever in town. The 4 members interpreted this as a definitive invitation. In April 1970, they arrived in Montreal with their instruments and roughly $100 in cash. The label executives were reportedly stunned by the band's unannounced arrival, but the group's sheer tenacity, the audacity to gamble everything on a polite brush-off, won them a contract. The early Montreal years were brutal. They toured Eastern Canada for 5 months with the band Mashmakan, playing small clubs and university venues, sleeping in vans, loading their own equipment. The grind was relentless. Night after night, they'd tear down their gear, drive, through snowstorms to the next town, set up again, and do it all over. This wasn't the glamorous rock and roll life promised in magazines. This was survival. Level 3. Breakthrough moment. Their self-titled debut, April Wine, released in 1971, was their proof of concept. The single Fast Train became a top 40 hit in Canada, peaking at number 38. It wasn't massive success, but it was survival. And survival meant they'd get to make another record. The validation came in small moments that meant everything. On July 30th, 1971, they opened for the Guess Who, one of Canada's biggest exports at the time. Standing on that stage, looking out at a crowd that actually knew their name, the dream suddenly felt possible. But the music industry has a way of reminding you that nothing is guaranteed. But even survival came with a cost. In the fall of 1971, bassist Jim Henman left the band to return to university. The societal pressure to secure a stable future over the uncertainty of a musical career claimed its first victim. He was replaced by Jim Clench, a Montreal native who brought a more aggressive bass style. The lineup was shifting. The dream was fragmenting, but they kept moving forward. The release of their second album, On Record, in 1972, changed everything. This album cracked the top 40 in the Canadian album charts and delivered 2 major hits: a cover of Elton John's Bad Side of the Moon, and a cover of Hot Chocolate's You Could Have Been a Lady. Sweet Lady. You Could Have Been a Lady reached number 2 in Canada and even made a modest appearance on the US charts. For a band from Waverley, Nova Scotia, this wasn't just success. It was validation that the impossible might actually be possible. Level 4, the peak, golden era. But success brought new tensions. During the recording of their third album, Electric Jewels in 1973, David and Richie Henman quit the group. The split pitted Goodwin and Clench against the Henman brothers, a dynamic common in bands where a single visionary begins to seize creative control. The replacements were pivotal. Drummer Jerry Mercer, a veteran of Mock Machon, and guitarist Gary Moffat joined the band, transforming April Wine from a bar band into a tighter, flashier arena contender. Electric Jewels became a fan favorite, featuring tracks like Weeping Widow that remain staples of Canadian classic rock radio today. By 1975, April Wine had established dominance in the Canadian market that was unprecedented. Their album Stand Back became the first album by a Canadian band to sell more than 100,000 copies domestically, eventually reaching platinum status. The Electric Adventure Tour featured high-octane stage effects, ringing fire bells, and rotating red lights. They weren't just playing music, they were creating spectacle. In 1976, The Whole World's Going Crazy became the first Canadian album to achieve platinum status based on advanced orders alone. It was difficult to turn on a Canadian radio without hearing April Wine. They had conquered their home country, but the machine was already beginning to grind them down. Level 5. Pressure, cracks, or conflict. The touring schedule was becoming unsustainable. 365 days a year on the road. Families back home growing distant. Relationships strained to the breaking point. The success they'd fought so hard to achieve was now consuming them from the inside. The transition from Canadian superstar to international rock powerhouse required a specific catalyst for April Wine. That catalyst arrived in March 1977 at the Elmer Combo Club in Toronto. The band was booked to play a charity concert. But what they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that the event was actually a secret residency for the Rolling Stones, who were performing under the pseudonym The Cockroaches. A local radio station organized a contest, asking fans, what would you do to see the Rolling Stones live? The winners were told they were going to see April Wine. Only after they were transported to the venue via a dozen buses did the truth reveal itself. They were witnessing a club show by the world's greatest rock band. April Wine's performances during those 2 nights were captured on the album Live at the Elmo Cambo. But more importantly, the association with the Stones became their passport to the international stage. Suddenly, they had the credibility to tour the United States as an opening act for the Stones, as well as arena giants like Styx, Rush, and Journey. In late 1977, the band made a strategic decision to expand their sound by adding a third guitarist, Brian Greenway. This transformed them into a 5-piece unit capable of a much denser, more aggressive sonic profile. The 3-guitar attack became their signature. Their 1978 album, First Glance, became their first gold record outside of Canada. The single Roller became a top 30 hit in the U.S., finding particularly strong traction in Detroit and Flint, Michigan. Music. The track's heavy riff and relentless drive resonated with the blue-collar industrial heartland of America, where guitar-driven rock was the cultural currency. The 1979 album Harder Faster cemented their reputation as arena rock mainstays. Songs like I Like to Rock and Say Hello were ubiquitous on both sides of the border. Harder Faster remained on the Billboard Top Album chart for 40 weeks. They weren't just successful, they were unstoppable. But beneath the platinum records and sold-out shows, cracks were forming. The constant pressure to deliver hits, the exhaustion of endless touring, and the weight of carrying an entire band's creative output was beginning to take its toll on Miles Goodwin. He was the engine that powered everything, but engines can only run so hot for so long before they start to burn out. January 1981, April Wine released The Nature of the Beast, an album that would eventually sell over 1 million copies in the U.S. and achieve multi-platinum status in Canada. This record represented a perfect synthesis of their hard rock foundations and a newly refined melodic sensibility. The primary driver of this success was the power ballad Just Between You and Me. Just Between You and Me. The song reached the top 25 on the Billboard Hot 100. But what made it historic was what happened on August 1st, 1981. MTV launched, and Just Between You and Me was the 14th video ever played on the network, making April Wine the first Canadian artist ever seen on MTV. Think about that. Before Madonna, before Michael Jackson's Thriller, before the British New Wave invasion, the band's appearance at the Monsters of Rock Festival at Castle Donington in England, before 60,000 people illustrated their global reach, they were no longer underdogs. They were peers to the biggest names in rock, but the hectic pace of this success, constant touring, media requirements, the pressure to maintain platinum sales, was extracting a terrible price. The album peaked at number 24 on the Billboard charts, and suddenly the band was everywhere. Radio, MTV, arena stages, magazine covers. The demand was insatiable, and the machine kept demanding more. Goodwin later reflected that this period felt less like triumph and more like a trap. Every success raised the stakes. Every hit meant the next one had to be bigger. The joy of making music was being replaced by the anxiety of maintaining an empire. Level 6, the collapse. The decline of April Wine wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a gradual fraying of the bonds that held the group together. The 1982 album Power Play performed reasonably well, reaching the Billboard Top 40 and yielding hits like Enough Is Enough, but it failed to match the critical or commercial heights of The Nature of the Beast. The pressure was mounting. Miles Goodwin, as the principal songwriter and producer, carried the weight of the band's creative future alone. He later reflected in his memoir that his role as the sole hitmaker created a sense of resentment and isolation. The other members performed, but Goodwin built the songs. The burden was crushing. Music seeking escape from the relentless pressure, Goodwin relocated to the Bahamas in the early 1980s. This move physically distanced the band's leader from his members at the precise moment when cohesion was most needed. The palm trees and tropical beaches offered a refuge from the grind, but they also created a psychological and geographical barrier that the band could never quite overcome. The recording sessions for the 1984 album Animal Grace were notoriously tense, exposing deep-seated fractures among the members. Arguments erupted over creative direction. Old resentment surfaced. The chemistry that had once made them unstoppable was now toxic. But the problem wasn't just internal. The entire music industry was undergoing a radical transformation. MTV and the new wave sound meant that the classic arena rock of the late 70s was being pushed to the margins by synth-driven, visually oriented acts. While April Wine had been MTV pioneers with Just Between You and Me, their overall aesthetic was rooted in gritty, blue-collar rock, a style the industry began to view as dated by 1984. Recognizing that the band could no longer function as a unified entity, April Wine announced their farewell tour in 1984. The final performance took place on July 31, 1984, in Kelowna, British Columbia. The dream was over. The brotherhood was broken. The machine had finally stopped. Level 7, Aftermath and Legacy. The years following the 1984 breakup was marked by silence. Miles Goodwin remained in the Bahamas for several years, eventually returning to Montreal and releasing a self-titled solo album in 1988. But something unexpected happened in 1992. After an 8-year hiatus, the band reunited for what was intended to be a brief tour of Canada. The response was overwhelming. Sold-out shows across Canada and the US proved that the band's legacy was stronger than the members themselves had realized. The reunion led to the 1993 album Attitude, which achieved gold status in Canada. The band continued to tour throughout the 1990s and 2000s, performing 80 to 100 shows a year. But they functioned more as a legacy act than a contemporary chart force. They were playing the greatest hits to audiences who wanted to relive their youth, not create new memories. It became a way to numb the pain, and eventually, it became a prison. In 2008, Miles Goodwin's long-term alcoholism resulted in a collapse and a near-death experience due to internal bleeding. This trauma served as a moment that changed the course of things, leading to his sobriety and the publication of his memoir, Just Between You and Me, in 2016. In the book, he detailed with brutal honesty the toll that rock stardom had taken, the broken relationships, the lost years, the price of success that no one talks about. In the 2010s, Goodwin's health was further challenged by diabetes, which made the physical demands of touring increasingly untenable. In 2009, they were inducted into the Canadian Music Industry Hall of Fame. In 2023, April Wine was inducted into Canada's Walk of Fame. Anne Miles Goodwin was inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. These honors restore dignity to their place in rock history and validate the memories of the millions who bought their records. The 20 million records sold is supported by a massive global discography that includes over 20 studio albums and multiple live releases. They were a band that achieved the triumph fantasy of the classic rock era. For the listener who recalls the first time they heard the soaring guitars of I Like to Rock or the romantic intimacy of Just Between You and Me, April Wine represents a validation of their own youth and the enduring power of melodic hard rock. The songs outlasted the band, the music outlasted the man. And that perhaps is the truest measure of success. They conquered arenas, sold 20 million records, and became MTV pioneers before the world knew what music videos were. But success came at a cost, measured in broken health, fractured brotherhood, and years lost to the grinding machine of rock and roll. The songs remain. The legacy endures. What's your memory of April Wine? Drop it in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more classic rock memories.